So we've seen how the Nazis have been able to take over Germany and start to attempt to reform Germany into their vision of what the fascism, their vision of what a Nazi state society should look like. We're now going to try and look at how it is that they're able to become an international threat, right? How does Nazi Germany become a threat to the rest of the world? Especially when you consider the fact that the Versailles Treaty required that the Germany maintain a small army, that it was not allowed to have an air force, and that there were certain places where it was not allowed to put troops, in particular an area called the Rhineland, which bordered with France and Belgium, which Germany had invaded during World War I. Well, in 1935, Hitler will expand his army and create an air force in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Countries will protest that he is violating the Versailles Treaty, but essentially nothing will be done. Then Hitler will take some of that new army he has created. In 1936, will send troops into the Rhineland, which was an area that was demilitarized. Hitler was not supposed to send troops there. And you can see a map here of Nazi Germany with the Rhineland. And you can see why France might be nervous to have troops there. As you can see, it borders with France. It also borders with Belgium and the Netherlands. So Hitler is expanding in a sense. Now, Hitler would respond when people criticized him saying, "We just want Germany to be a normal country." Other countries are allowed to put its military where it wants, and other countries are allowed to have a military. Should not Germany also be allowed to have a military and to place soldiers where it wants along its borders? And that's not a bad argument, right? It's not a bad argument. And so people said, many people, especially many national leaders, but they were supported oftentimes by their people, said, okay, what Hitler wants is reasonable. If we give it to him, he will not do anything else, right? They made an assumption that he was a reasonable person that was making reasonable requests. And if those requests, or perhaps I should say demands, were honored, then he would stop making requests. In 1938 then, Hitler would use the military he had developed, starting in 1935, and annex Austria, and then seize a good portion of Czechoslovakia. And if you look here at this map, you can see that Austria is on the southern border of Germany, and that Czechoslovakia is on the southeastern border. And this Austria was consisted of ethnic Germans. It's a little bit complex. Remember, though Adolf Hitler was himself an Austrian, Austrians spoke German. So the annexation of Austria was presented as just uniting Germany along nationalist principles. And of course, countries like France, Great Britain, and so on, even the United States, had accepted the idea of national self-determination and the underlying concept of nationalism, and many Austrians supported becoming part of Germany. So again, this did not seem too strange. This did not seem crazy or necessarily all that dangerous. So once again, people said, okay, national leaders said, okay, what Germany is asking for is rational, so we will accept it. The issue with Czechoslovakia is a lot more complex. Czechoslovakia was a new country in a sense that was basically created through the Versailles Treaty. And controversially, much more controversially than these other issues, the countries of Europe, the nations of Europe, allowed for Germany to take a large part of Czechoslovakia on the reasoning that that part that they took was mostly German ethnically. Right, so Germany will take a part of Czechoslovakia that is majority ethnic German. So thus far, this seems, again, kind of reasonable. I'm not saying it's right, but the argument is we accept the principles of nationalism. Each nation should have its own state. The French have France, don't they? The British have Britain, don't they? So why can't the Germans have Germany? all we're doing is following through with that principle. And many people said, okay, that's fine. Many leaders at the time said, that's fine. That's what needs to be done. We will accept that because Hitler's demands are reasonable, and the alternative to accepting them is war. And remember how bad that last war was. Remember how bad World War I was. So again, while some people did oppose this, an increasing number, because Czechoslovakia had been created in a sense, out of this post-World War I order, it had treaties with other countries that were supposed to basically protect it, but we're just going to let Hitler have what he wants because the alternative is war, and he seems reasonable, and after this he probably won't ask for anything else because thus far he's been asking for countries that are majority ethnic German, or regions that are majority ethnic German. Now, there were people who opposed appeasement, who thought appeasement was a terrible idea. If you look at that picture on the right, it is a comic, and you may just notice that the art style is similar to that of Dr. Seuss's books like Cat in the Hat. And there's a good reason for that. Dr. Seuss was an anti-appeaser who wrote that comic. He created that comic. And you can see there, Uncle Sam says, and on this platform, the most amazing marvel of the age, he lives, he talks, yet the guy has no guts. And then it says, appeaser on the right, on the man's shirt. So anti-appeasers said that appeasement was basically a cowardly policy, that Hitler was a bully, that he was not someone you could reason with, he was not someone you could compromise with, and that in the end his ambitions were basically limitless, that he would not stop in his conquests until someone stopped him. Right? That was the basic idea of the anti-appeasers. Right? The pro-appeaser said Hitler is asking for very reasonable things. Once you give him those reasonable things, he will stop expanding. The anti-appeasers said, no, he's not just asking for reasonable things. He's just getting stronger. His ambitions have no limit. If we don't stop him now, he's going to keep going, and we'll eventually have to stop him later when he's more powerful. Better to have guts and stop him now. Now, it's, of course, always convenient to try and go, if we look back and say, well, I would have done this, and because this was the right thing to do. It's much easier to see what the right thing to do is looking back. Appeasement at the time was popular, anti-appeasement less so. But looking back, considering what Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, it would seem that it would make sense to oppose appeasement, that Hitler should have been dealt with early on, right? His ideology calls for unceasing expansion. It was right there in Mein Kampf, but people, for whatever reason, ignored that. In part because they wanted peace, because they remembered how bad the First World War was. Now, one thing that's kind of shocking that Hitler will do is in 1939, he will sign a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, which is really striking because, remember, he saw communism as his primary enemy. And now he just promised that he will not attack the only existing communist country. And not only that, this serves as a foundation for him to divide Poland with the Soviet Union, right? He's going to divide up Poland with the Soviet Union. And on this map, you can kind of see the situation we're now in. Germany looks bigger. It's absorbed Austria and a large part of Czechoslovakia, and where it says the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, that's essentially become a German sort of colony. It's part of the German Empire. But you can see where Hitler has invaded Poland. He's got the part to the west, the western part of Poland. The Soviet Union has taken the eastern part of Poland. Right? This happens in 1939. Hitler's invasion of Poland shows the problem with appeasement. It shows that Hitler's ambition was limitless. He had justified all his other expansion based on the idea that Germany should be a normal country that has a military, can put soldiers where it wants, and that he was only unifying Germans. He was just bringing all Germans into one nation state, just like France had done with the French. I mean, isn't that reasonable? But by invading Poland, this is just, in a sense, naked ambition. Because, of course, Poland is not inhabited primarily by Germans. It is inhabited primarily by Poles, by Polish people. So in invading Poland, Hitler is saying, I want every piece of territory I can get. I want all the resources I can get, which is what he had been saying in Mein Kampf, if anyone would have read it and taken it seriously. So it's at this point that the countries like that had previously followed a policy of appeasement realized that that was a terrible policy. It ended up being wrong. They are going to declare war on Germany. in particular France and Britain, will declare war on Germany at this point. Now, I should point out that Nazi Germany was not the only country that was expanding, right? The Soviet Union will expand and take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, right, which are countries just to the northeast of Poland, just to the west of the Soviet Union. And this is why in a previous section, you may remember I said that the Soviet Union will pretend to be anti-imperialist, but will behave like an empire. This is why I said that, right? This is why I said that. And so one thing we have to stress is in this time period, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were behaving in a very similar way. And one thing I think is fascinating, when the first issue of Action Comics, which is the title in which Superman is introduced, it comes out in 1940, the very first issue has this panel in the comic in which Superman has basically kidnapped Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler and brought them to an international court where a judge states, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, we pronounce you guilty of modern history's greatest crime, unprovoked aggression against defenseless countries. Right? So in a sense, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are following this policy of expansion, taking over nation states, independent nation states, most of which had, in a sense, been created by the post-World War I order. So to kind of review and kind of make this a little bit more clear why people followed appeasement, right, the policy of appeasement, even though it seems so bad from our perspective in this time today, we again want to stress that they thought that Hitler was making reasonable demands that would have a limit. And you could make an argument that these demands were limited until the invasion of Poland, in which case it was clear that Hitler just wanted to take as much territory as possible. And of course, to their credit, that's when people gave up on appeasement and Great Britain and France declared war. But it was predicated on this idea that Hitler was just asking for limited things that he could be appeased with if you gave them to him. And the alternative seemed to be a war, and people remembered how bad the Great War was, and there was political pressure not to have another war. But there's one other big reason, and that's at the time period, Great Britain and France did not know which side the Soviet Union would be on, right? Remember, before World War I, Russia was on the side of Britain and France. And even with Russia on its side and attacking Germany from the east, so Germany had to fight a two-front war, Great Britain, France, and Russia still darn near lost World War I, right? Remember, Russia drops out, and the United States' entry is key to turning the tide towards Great Britain and France. But now the Soviet Union is acting a lot like Nazi Germany. And it wasn't clear to them that if they did go to war with Germany, what side the Soviet Union might be on. If the Soviet Union decided to stay neutral or decided to ally with Germany, then that would have been very bad for Great Britain and France. They probably would have lost, especially if Soviet Union would have allied with Germany. And it's not unthinkable considering that they did engage in this division of Poland together. So the key thing, what made Great Britain and France very hesitant and willing to follow a policy of appeasement was this fear, which side would the Soviet Union be on, right? We barely defeated Germany in World War I when we had Russia helping us. What happens if the Soviet Union doesn't help us or turns against us? But in the end, with the invasion of Poland, Britain and France decided that they just couldn't allow this to continue, that they had to do something. They saw Germany as the most immediate threat because Germany is adjacent, is neighboring to France, and so they declared war on Germany. Note, though, they didn't declare war on the Soviet Union. They knew they couldn't take them both on at the same time. There is a saying that we always prepare for the last war, which makes sense, right? You know, we're going to try and we just fought a war. Okay, we're going to have to fight another war. Let's see what we did right in the last war. Let's see what we did wrong, and then let's fight our war based on that. So the French were convinced that the World War II would be a repeat of World War I, which emphasized trench warfare, focusing on the defense, in which the defense was at a much greater advantage than the offense. So the French built this thing called the Maginot Line, right? The Maginot Line was a line of fortifications with the border with Germany that would be very difficult to actually take, right? You can tell these is really well developed. They've got all this barbed wire. They got tank barricades. They have heavy artillery. They even have underground hangars to store planes, and they can bring them up and fly them around as needed. The fortress, as it says, it's air conditioned, and there's air pressure to keep out gas. So this is an extremely powerful fortification designed with the idea that you're going to have another war similar to World War I in which the defense has the biggest advantage. And there you can see where the Maginot Line was constructed. That area that says strong fortifications, which is in a kind of bold red line. Now, can you see the problem? Very good. The problem is that there is also a line of weak fortifications. The Maginot Line does not go all the way across. And you may say, oh, this doesn't seem like a good idea. Why would the French do that? And they actually had good reason for doing this. First of all, they were concerned that for political reasons, Belgium was afraid that if France built strong fortifications along their border with Belgium, that would indicate to the Belgians that they would not defend Belgium. Right? And Belgium was an ally of France when they were building the Maginot Line. So the French, in order to show that they were willing to stand with the Belgians, that they would not abandon the Belgians if Germany did invade, they did not construct the fort all the way across. So the Maginot Line will just be confined to that red area. Now, the other issue was the French were not dumb. They realized this. But their goal was not so much to just stop the Germans, but to force the German troops to go in a particular direction so they could set up like an ambush, right? They knew the Germans would not try and go through the strong fortifications. They thought that they would try and go through Belgium, through those weaker fortifications, and then the French could like put their army and ambush the Germans when they came through. So that was basically France's strategy. So France had this strong line of fortifications along Germany, on the German border, a weak group of fortifications along the Belgian border, and it was their hope that that would force the German troops to come through in a particular direction, through a particular area, and then the French army could just crush those German troops because they knew where they would be coming. However, there is a serious problem with this strategy, and that is the development of what we call Blitzkrieg. The Germans didn't much use this word, but we use it now to talk about this style of warfare, and I think it's a good word to use. Blitzkrieg literally means lightning war. Blitz means lightning. So if you're familiar with like the name of Santa's reindeers, one is named Blitzen. It means lightning. Krieg means war. So Blitzkrieg means lightning war. Now this painting is very busy. There is a whole lot of stuff going on here, but I think this shows us how Blitzkrieg works. Blitzkrieg follows the idea that infantry, artillery, tanks, and airplanes should work together quickly to defeat the enemy. That's why it's called Blitzkrieg. It's meant to very quickly defeat the enemy. Basically, the idea is you have the tanks, and the tanks can move very quickly, and you'll have them followed by mechanized infantry, like mechanized infantry in like pickup truck type things called half tracks, and they will go forward, and the tanks will blow up the enemy. And if they run into like a fortified town where tanks don't work very well, the infantry will be used to clear out the town, supported by the tanks. But you don't want to. Tanks are not that great in cities, so that's the infantry's job to deal with that. If they're being attacked by like artillery, then they will use radios to call in airplanes, dive bombers, for example, that will come in and destroy the enemy artillery. So the idea is that this is a mechanized force that works together, that can move very quickly, and thus decisively defeat its opponents. Ideally, they can even surround, using their great speed, their opponents, and then by surrounding their enemy, crush them. And to give you a sense of how of like the technology that helps with this, for example, German tanks all had radios. And I don't mean one-way radios so they could like listen to music. I mean two-way radios so they could talk to each other. So tanks were able to talk to each other, right? and mobilize and be able to communicate with each other and organize their tactics. They could also talk to people in the airplanes, or they could talk to the people controlling the airplanes, and thereby they could coordinate together, right? So this Blitzkrieg allows the Germans to be able to quickly surround their enemies, to make sure that they're using whatever weapons work best, and therefore quickly defeat their enemies. And the problem is that this is just, they're able to completely outclass the French army. They're much more, and the British who come to help the French, they are going to be much faster, much quicker, and much better coordinated than the British and the French forces. For example, British tanks did not have two-way radios in them, so you can imagine that it was difficult for them to actually coordinate their tactics. So this will allow them to very quickly defeat the French and British troops, right? Germany will very quickly defeat those British and French troops in the year 1940. The capital of Paris will fall in just a few weeks, right? Remember, the Germans had spent 4 years in World War I trying to seize France's capital, Paris. They had managed to seize it in 6 weeks in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, but they have now seized Paris very quickly, and they are marching the German troops past the Arc de Triomphe, which is meant to celebrate the victories of Napoleon. One kind of fascinating part of history, I think, I would say it's a kind of trivia, but it shows to us how Hitler saw this as revenge for Versailles. When the Germans were forced to sign the Versailles Treaty, they were forced to sign it in a railway car. And the French had preserved the railway car as a kind of relic showing their victory when the Germans tried to invade. Adolf Hitler would actually have that railroad car found, and he would force the French to sign their surrender in that very same railway car, where, previously, just a couple decades previously, the Germans had been forced to sign a surrender. Right, so getting revenge for the indignity of Versailles. And here you can see Adolf Hitler. He's in the center right, as well as a lot of Nazi officers visiting Paris for kind of a holiday in front of the Eiffel Tower. The French will continue to resist, even though their military will be defeated. French partisans will continue to attack Nazis using guerrilla-style warfare. And you can see that there was both male partisans as well as female partisans. But man or woman, when the French do anything, as you can see from these pictures, they did it with style. But that being said, the Allies are in a serious situation. Britain now stands alone against the full might of the Nazi war machine. Now, Britain was successfully able to evacuate much of its army from France, as well as some of France's army from Dunkirk, an area in northwestern France close to Great Britain. But there is a serious, serious problem, right? It's not clear what can be done. Britain isn't so much thinking of trying to liberate France now, it's just thinking, how can we survive? Right? Nazi Germany has taken over by this time much of Europe and has many more resources than Great Britain does. And in fact, the Germans are preparing to try and invade Great Britain. Now, the thing is, based on the technology of the time, and even to this day, you cannot really invade a country unless you have control over the skies above that country. Right? If you try and bring an invasion force without having air superiority, the enemy air force will just destroy the transports that are bringing troops and so forth. So you cannot invade a country without holding control of the skies. Your invasion force will just be destroyed by your enemy's air force. The Germans will try to take control of the airspace over Britain in preparation for an invasion, but they will fail. The British will fight very hard. We refer to this as the Battle of Britain. The great leader of Britain during this time would refer to this as their finest hour. But basically, the Germans are not able to defeat the Royal Air Force, the RAF, and are therefore not able to invade. So the Germans will turn to a policy of terror bombing of London. We have, as well as other cities. And we have seen this before in World War I. But this time they have much more effective bombers. So this is going to do a lot more damage to London and to other cities in Great Britain. But this is basically an attempt to force the British to give up. And you may have seen like these posters that say keep calm and something on. These are based off of the actual propaganda posters used by the British to encourage their people to continue living their lives and resisting the Nazis despite this terror bombing. And this was a slogan, keep calm and carry on. And this picture, I think, is very striking because you can see a British person trying to live this out, right? This is an area that has clearly been recently bombed. I mean, there's smoke in the background, for goodness sakes. It seems there's still fires. And this guy's still trying to deliver the milk. He's keeping calm and carrying on. And that kind of British pluck, as they would say, or British willingness to endure, will enable them to hold out against the terror bombing until help can arrive. And then, despite not having defeated Britain, in fact, despite not having been able to even obtain air superiority over Britain, Hitler will launch Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was an attack on the Soviet Union. Please remember that Hitler had just a few months previously negotiated a settlement with the Soviet Union in which they would divide up Poland between them. And of course, before that, had signed a non-aggression pact promising not to invade or attack the Soviet Union. So this is what I mean about Hitler being a tremendous liar. So Hitler, despite not being able to defeat Britain, has decided to invade the Soviet Union in what we call Operation Barbarossa. And this raises a rather large question. Why attack the Soviet Union when Britain was still in the war? Why, when you are unable to defeat an enemy, would you attack another enemy, especially one as powerful as the Soviet Union? Well, there were several reasons why Hitler would do this. First of all, he saw the Soviet Union as his main ideological enemy. As made clear in Mein Kampf and in lots of speeches Hitler gave after that, Hitler saw communism as a terrible enemy, as in fact the main enemy. He didn't see capitalist liberal democracy as such a threat. He saw it as fundamentally weak. He did, however, see communism as fundamentally strong and a threat. Moreover, he realized, of course, that Stalin's reforms were working, and as terrible as the means Stalin followed were, they were building up an increasingly powerful, industrialized Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was becoming stronger, right? The Soviet Union was becoming stronger. So Hitler thought, I need to invade now, because if I do not, the Soviet Union will become even stronger tomorrow. Right? I have to invade now because it will be that much harder to invade tomorrow. Moreover, Hitler thought that once Britain saw that the Soviet Union had been defeated, once Hitler had defeated the Soviet Union, he thought Britain would give in. Right? So Hitler said, okay, we're not defeating the British. Let's attack the Soviet Union. After all, we're a powerful land power. Let's attack the Soviet Union. Once we defeat the Soviet Union, that's the last really possible ally for Great Britain. They will just surrender once we've defeated the Soviet Union. Finally, one key issue is this. Blitzkrieg, you may recall, relied on mechanized military units. It relied on tanks and mechanized infantry, that is, infantry riding around on trucks or half-tracks. And of course, it relied on airplanes, all of which need fuel, all of which need fundamentally oil. Germany needed resources. In particular, it lacked oil. Great Britain does not have large deposits of oil. So for Adolf Hitler to seize Great Britain would not really do anything. Conquering Great Britain wouldn't really help Germany that much. On the other hand, conquering the oil fields of the Caucasus in southwestern Soviet Union would give Hitler the oil he would need to continue expansion. So for those reasons, Hitler does something that kind of seems crazy to us and in retrospect was the wrong decision. But at the time, for these reasons, it made sense. The Soviet Union was his main enemy. He didn't really care that much about the British. In fact, he had some admiration for the British as a people who could claim some Germanic ancestry. He realized the Soviet Union was becoming stronger, so he needed to hit them right away. And he also believed that, once he defeats the Soviet Union, that takes care of the British problem, and he needed those resources. Now, Joseph Stalin, and this is astounding, Joseph Stalin, as I described earlier, the leader of the Soviet Union, was an extraordinarily paranoid man. He didn't trust anyone, including his own family, and yet he trusted Hitler. He thought when Hitler promised that he would not invade the Soviet Union, that he would keep his promise, at least for the time being. So despite reports that the German military units were massing along the Soviet border, Stalin said, it doesn't mean anything. They're not going to attack. And then the Soviet Union was attacked by Adolf Hitler. And this blunder of Stalin's almost destroyed the Soviet Union. The Germans almost pulled this off. They got really close to knocking the Soviet Union out of the war. So again, this seems kind of crazy in retrospect, but we have to emphasize it almost did work, in particular because of Stalin's blunder in not reacting as the Germans were preparing to invade. So the initial German invasion will go quite well. Now, this will, of course, bring the Soviet Union into the war on the Allied side. Now the Soviet Union will have a side, right? It is at war with Germany. Britain is also at war with Germany, and that essentially makes the Soviet Union and Great Britain de facto allies. And this, of course, later on, as we'll see, the United States will be attacked by Japan. Hitler will declare war on the United States, and that brings us into this war as well. And this leads to the so-called Big Three. The Big Three allies being Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the leader of the United States, and Winston Churchill, the leader of Great Britain. And one thing I should stress, of course, is that they're united by their hatred of fascism. They're united by what they're against, but they're not united by what they are for, right? Stalin is for communism. He thinks capitalism is terrible, the main problem plaguing human society, whereas Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, as member of capitalist liberal democracies, thinks that capitalism is great and is essentially the answer to the world problems. So they're united by their hatred of fascism and by their fact that Nazi Germany is their opponent, but that's basically the only thing keeping these guys together. And later I should point out they'll be expanded to the Big Four, with Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of China, being the fourth leader. The man who wrote that letter was a member of what was called the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen were German soldiers who had the special detail of following after the Nazi advance into the Soviet Union, and they were also, as an aside, active in the campaign against Poland. But they followed the advance units, went into the towns and the countryside and wherever, and found Jews and other people that the Nazis did not want around anymore, and systematically shot them. Right, thousands, tens of thousands, and then hundreds of thousands, then I think something like 1 million. Right, so the reason why the man did not want to talk about his work in the previous slide was because his work was shooting unarmed civilians. This was men, women, children, young, old. It did not matter if you were part of this group of people who was considered undesirable, especially if you were Jewish, you were rounded up and shot. And the reason that he mentioned we have to eat and drink well because of our work reflects the fact that a lot of times these men had to get extraordinarily drunk in order to carry out the shootings. And I should point out that if something is so bad that you need to get drunk to do it, you probably shouldn't do it. Right? It's probably a bad idea. But that, in a sense, reflects this the fact that they realized that what they were doing was wrong, but they wanted to do it anyway. Right? And one thing that I think is really astounding is that the soldiers, there were a few soldiers who refused to do this. There were some soldiers who said, I'm not going to do this. Nothing really happened to them. Their commanding officers would insult them, and usually they wouldn't get promoted. But if you were a member of this Einsatzgruppen and you refused to kill Jewish people, they would basically just transfer you out. They wouldn't really punish you in any real way. So it wasn't like, oh, I have to shoot these people or I'll be killed. It wasn't like that at all. But I have to stress, the German army found that this was very bad for discipline. Some of these Einsatzgruppen soldiers, like I said, they had to get drunk to do this, and others started going crazy. Like I said, signs that what you're doing is wrong, and so you should probably stop. Unfortunately, as we will see as this lesson progresses, they do not stop. They continue to kill Jews and other people who are considered undesirable. While the German advance into the Soviet Union would enjoy a great deal of success, the Germans will face problems. And one of them is a transformation that has been undertaken in the Red Army, the army of the Soviet Union. If you compare the past armies fielded by Russia with the army the Germans faced of the Soviet Union, they were quite different. The Russian armies of World War I typically had good troops. Russians were generally good soldiers. They were brave. They had a strong Russian identity and so were willing to sacrifice on behalf of their country. However, they were poorly led and they were usually poorly supplied. And you may recall I gave you an example of how Russian soldiers would sometimes be sent into battle without guns or would be expected to throw rocks at the enemy. At present, though, in terms of what the Nazis were facing, Russian armies, the armies of the Soviet Union, still had good troops, but the leadership was much improved, and also they had industrialized their country to a great deal. So their troops did have guns and were not reduced to throwing rocks. And in fact, their troops had some very good weapons, especially they had very good tanks. So Stalin's crash course of industrialization, as cruel as it was, did work. The Soviet Union will have a much stronger industrial base than Imperial Russia had. And so that will help as they face off against the Nazis. And of course, later on, when Britain and the United States come into the war, we will send massive amounts of supplies to the Soviet Union. I think something like 80% of the Soviet Union's pickup trucks, for example, that were used in the war were, or I should say trucks, they were not usually pickup trucks, they were trucks, were supplied by the United States. The Germans enjoyed a great deal of initial success when they invaded in the fall of 1941. However, they will run into some problems very quickly. The Soviet Union is famous, especially the Russian part of the Soviet Union, is famous for its winters. They're very snowy and very cold. And what happened is, during this time period, there was a very bad winter, one of the worst in history, in fact. And that, of course, slowed down the Blitzkrieg. Remember, the Blitzkrieg, this lightning war, was based around moving fast. Well, you can't move fast in the ice and snow. And you also can't move particularly fast or at all when your engine freezes up. So this will slow down the Germans a great deal. And even then, when the snow melts, it just becomes mud. And so what happened was you had a really nasty winter followed by a very wet spring, and basically much of Russia became a sea of mud, and the Germans, again, had trouble moving around. In addition, the Soviet Union is just gigantic. It's just huge. And it takes time to move through it. So this combination of snow and a muddy spring and this issue of space will give time for the Russians to relocate their factories. They will actually pick up, dismantle, and move factories to mobilize their population to resist and to rebuild their armies. And as I said in the previous slide, they had pretty good armies. In addition, one thing about Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, they were not good at working together. In particular, Hitler was a terrible ally. He was very poor at telling the Japanese what he was going to do. So after Hitler, now what I should say is ideally, if Japan and Germany would have worked together, Germany would have attacked the Soviet Union from the west, Japan would have attacked the Soviet Union from the east, and the Soviet Union would have had to fight a two-front war. That could have crushed the Soviet Union. However, because Nazi Germany decided to publicly have a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and because Nazi Germany had partitioned Poland with the Soviet Union, Japan decided that instead of attacking the Soviet Union, because it looked pretty clear that Nazi Germany would not, that they would be committed to war against the United States in the winter of 1941. So because Germany didn't tell Japan what it was planning on doing, Japan decided that instead of helping to attack the Soviet Union, they would attack the United States as well as the colonies of Britain and the Netherlands as well. And we'll talk more about that later. But what that meant was the Soviet Union, especially after Japan got in war with the United States, could shift its troops west to fight the Germans. Right? This poor planning really hurt them. So in the end, the Germans will be defeated in Russia, and they will not get Russian oil. I didn't mention it, but the Germans were also trying to invade North Africa to get the oil there. They will also fail there. And the fact that they can't get the oil, the fact that they lose in Russia, will be, in a sense, the beginning of the end for Hitler's expansionist efforts.